So before further proceeding towards the presentation, I will give my introduction. I will give my introduction. My name is Srijal Rai and my branch is mechanical. I am student of Sri Ramdev Baba College of Engineering and Management. So my topic of discussion today is extrusion. I will be explaining the extrusion process in detail in this presentation. So in this next slide, we will see what are the contents of extrusion. The contents of extrusion are introduction of extrusion, classification of extrusion, direct or forward extrusion, advantage and disadvantage of direct extrusion, indirect or backward extrusion, advantage and disadvantage of indirect extrusion, advantage and disadvantage and application of extrusion process, difference between direct and indirect extrusion. So in this slide we are seeing what is the introduction of extrusion process. The process of extrusion consists of compressing a metal inside a chamber to force it through small opening called die. Plastic material can be extruded successfully. The pressure may be either applied hydraulically or mechanically. This operation is similar to the squeezing of toothpaste out of the toothpaste tube. The principle of operation for hot extrusion and cold extrusion are same. The extrusion may be defined as the manufacturing process in which block of metal is enclosed in a container is forced to flow through the opening of die. The metal may be subjected to plastic deformation as it undergo reduction and elongation during extrusion. The section of product will depend on the shape of the die opening. The principle of extrusion may be understood with the help of simple example which we have discussed, the squeezing of toothpaste from a tube. The cross section of extruded paste represent the area of opening the die. The toothpaste inside the tube remain in semi-solid state. In this process could be well considered as adaptation of closed die forging. What happened in closed die forging? The difference being that in forging the main body of the metal is the product and the flash is cut away and discarded. But in extrusion process, the flash is the product and the slag remaining in the die is not used. Extrusion is more widely used in manufacture of solid and hollow section from non-ferrous metal and alloy. For example, aluminium alloy, copper, brass, bronze. But steel and other ferrous alloy can be successfully processed with the development of molten glass lubricant. The product of extrusions are rod from 3 to 250 mm in diameter and the pipes of 200 to 400 mm diameter and wall thickness of 1 mm and above. Extrusion is done in hot as well as in cold conditions. Methods of extrusions are direct or forward extrusion, indirect or backward extrusion, or tube extrusion. So in this slide, we are also discussing the introduction part of the extrusion process. What are the choices which is essential for the extrusion process and are the important factor for the extrusion process? The metal to be extruded. What should be the size of the raw material which should be extruded? What should be the capacity of the press to extrude the metal? What should be the thickness of the extruded sections of the metal? What type of product should be used in the extrusion process? The billet of 125 mm to 175 mm in diameter and 300 to 675 mm in length are generally used as a raw material for the extrusion process. So the billet diameter approximate to 125 to 175 mm and billet length is 300 to 675 mm is used for the extrusion process as a raw material. Extrusion of steel needs adequate lubrication around the billet. So adequate lubrication is necessary around the billet so it can protect it from wear and tear. This is done by providing a coating of finely powered glass over the surface of hot billet. Extrusion suit best for the non-ferrous metals and alloy. Although some alloy steels like stainless steel are also extruded. Rods, tubes, molding trims, structural shapes, capable stretching, hose casing, brass, cartridge, aircraft part, gear profile and hardware items are the typical products of metal extrusion. So in the next slide, we will see the classification of extrusion process. So the classification of extrusion process is that the extrusion may be divided on the basis of direction by the means of operating temperature and by the means of equipment. By the means of direction, the extrusion process is further divided into direct or forward extrusion and indirect or backward extrusion. By the means of operating temperature, the extrusion is divided into hot extrusion and cold extrusion. By the means of equipment, the extrusion is further divided into horizontal and vertical extrusion. So in this slide, we can see the diagram of direct or forward extrusion. In this diagram, we can see a extruded metal, which is a billet, and a die is provided to support this billet. A die holder is also provided to support this billet, and a container is provided. Inside a container, extruded metal and ram and dummy block is placed. We can notice here that extruded metal and ram direction is in same. So it is in same direction. So we can conclude that it is a direct or forward extrusion. A heated round billet is produced in the container. The dummy block and ram are now positioned properly. As the pressure is applied, when the pressure is applied, the extruded metal come out of the die. जब हम लोग प्रेशर लगाएंगे, जो एक्सट्रूडेड मेटल जो होता है वो डाई के बाहर आ जाएगा. द प्रेशर इज विड्रॉन व्हेन नियरली 10% ऑफ बिलेट रिमेन्स इन द चेम्बर. प्रेशर तभी हटता है जब 10% ऑफ बिलेट जो है वो चैम्बर के अंदर रहता है. द पोर्शन इज कॉल्ड डिस्कार्ड. जो 10% पोर्शन जो है बिलेट का, जो बिलेट चेम्बर के अंदर रहता है, उस पोर्शन को हम लोग डिस्कार्ड कहते हैं. द लेंथ ऑफ एक्सट्रूडेड पार्ट विल डिपेंड ऑन द साइज ऑफ द बिलेट. जो एक्सट्रूडेड पार्ट का लेंथ है वो डिपेंड करेगा साइज ऑफ द बिलेट के. एंड द क्रॉस सेक्शन ऑफ डाई, डाई का कितना क्रॉस सेक्शन है उस पर डिपेंड करेगा. द एक्सट्रूडेड रॉड इज सपोर्टेड ऑन अ रन आउट टेबल. एक्सट्रूडेड रॉड को हम लोग किससे सपोर्ट करते हैं? एक रन आउट टेबल पे. In this process, we can see the metal is extruded in the direction of applied force. Hence, it is known as direct or forward extrusion. So this is the explanation of direct extrusion process, how the direct extrusion process work. In direct extrusion, the billet of metal is placed in a die chamber and a dummy block and the ram is placed into the position. The ram forces the hot billet through the die opening, producing extruded product. With the application of ram pressure, the metal first practically fills the cylindrical shape and it then forced out through the die opening until a small amount of remain in the container. It is then sword off next to the die and the butt ends removed. Direct extrusion method is most popular method. The die cavity can be given any shape which is desired on the extruded part. The process is relatively fast and necessary trimming is accomplished at the time the part leave the die. So in this slide, we can see the advantages and disadvantages of direct extrusion. The advantages of direct extrusion is that this process is relatively fast as compared to the other process. The maximum number of extruded part is produced. In this process, we can produce a maximum number of parts. The disadvantage of direct extrusion is that it is usually practiced to leave the nearly 10% of billet as unextruded. The portion is known as discard contains some impurities of the billet. मतलब ये प्रोसेस में क्या रहता है, जो 10% जो रहता है बिलेट का वो कंटेनर के अंदर ही रह जाता है, जिसकी वजह से हम उसको एक्सट्रूड नहीं कर सकते हैं. और उसको एक्सट्रूड नहीं करने की वजह से वो पोर्शन वहीं पे डिस्कार्ड की तरह, जिसको हम लोग डिस्कार्ड बोलते हैं, और उसमें कुछ इम्प्योरिटीज रहती है बिलेट के. So in this we can see a diagram of direct or backward extrusion. In this we can see a closure plate. Inside a container, billet, die and a ram is provided. What difference we can notice in direct or indirect extrusion? The difference is that the ram is solid, the ram is hollow. In case of direct extrusion, the ram was solid. And one more difference is that the extruded metal direction and the ram direction is in opposite direction. But in case of direct extrusion, the ram and extruded metal direction was in same direction. So it was called as forward extrusion. But in this extrusion, the ram and the extruded metal direction is in opposite direction. So we will call as backward direction or indirect extrusion. Or one more difference is that dummy block is not provided because dummy block is not necessary in the backward extrusion. So indirect or backward extrusion. In this method, the ram is used is hollow and the die is mounted over the bore of the ram as shown in the figure which we have seen in the previous slide. As the ram presses the billet against the back wall of the closed chamber, the metal is extruded back into the hollow ram. The metal thus flow in the opposite direction to the movement of the ram. The force required to compress the metal is less since there is no friction between the billet and container. When there will be no friction between the billet and the container, there will be no wear and tear. So it will be the good for the extrusion process. The method has certain limitation as in this method the ram is made hollow, hence it is weak. Moreover, there is no adequate support for the extruded parts. The process of direct and indirect extrusion may be done by hot or cold depending upon the material. Copper, alloy, aluminium, and magnesium are extruded hot, while lead, solder, and zinc are extruded either hot or cold. So in this slide, we will discuss what are the advantage and disadvantage of indirect extrusion. The advantages of indirect extrusion is that the force requirement to compress the metal is less and there is no friction between the billet and the container. So wear and tear is not possible of the metal. Disadvantages of indirect extrusion. In this method, ram is made hollow, hence it is weak. No adequate support for the extruded part. There is a no support for the extruded part. In case of direct extrusion, there was the support for the extruded part. So in this slide, we will discuss advantage and disadvantage of extrusion process. Advantages of extrusion process. Die may be readily removed and replaced. Cross-section shapes can be extruded. Dimensional accuracy of the extruded part. Very large reductions are possible as compared to rolling. Disadvantages of extrusion. High tooling cost. In extrusion, productivity is much inferior to rolling. Extrusion costs are generally greater as compared to other. Service life of extrusion tooling is short. So in this current slide, we will discuss the application of extrusion process. What are the applications of extrusion process? Small and medium batch production. Extrusion process are working on any plastic material, non-ferrous metal and other alloys. Extrusion process are used in manufacture of parts of high dimensional accuracy. Extrusion process are used in manufacturing of shapes and pipes of complex configuration. So in this slide, we will discuss the difference between the direct and indirect extrusion. So in this method, the solid ram is used. In case of indirect extrusion, the ram used is hollow. In case of direct extrusion, the force requirement to compress the metal is more. In case of indirect extrusion, the force requirement to compress the metal is less. In case of direct extrusion, the dummy block is used during the operation. In case of indirect extrusion, the block may or may not be used during the operation. In this method, in the direct method, handling of extruded metal is very easy. In case of indirect extrusion, handling of extruded metal is difficult. Thank you. In this slide, in this presentation, we have discussed what is the extrusion process, what are the classification of extrusion process, what are the two types of extrusion process such as direct extrusion or indirect extrusion, and we have seen their advantages and applications of direct or indirect extrusion. In last part, we have seen the direct extrusion advantages and disadvantages, and we have compared the direct or indirect extrusion. So this was all about this presentation. Thank you.